Welcome back to Movies and Cool Stuff. My name is David Craig, and this week I rewatched the entire Resident Evil film series. It's something I do from time to time because for some reason I am drawn to them like a moth to a flame. But this time was slightly different because I also went to the trouble of jotting down my first thoughts on each film on the movie review app Letterboxd. So that's going to serve as the basis of this video. I want to do a full retrospective of Milla Jovovich's magnum opus, and I'm stringing you along with me. Apologies for that. Let's kick things off with the film that started it all, Resident Evil. Now, here's what I had to say. I don't think this first Resident Evil movie has aged particularly well. There's some weird editing and some absolutely jaw-droppingly bad CGI. They attempt to introduce the liquor monster from the Resident Evil video games, and it looks absolutely abysmal. And maybe it always did, I'm not sure. But I think one area where this film really falls down in comparison to what comes later is the action. Paul W.S. Anderson, at this stage in his career, seems to think that a close-up shot of a gun firing counts as an action sequence, and that really couldn't be further from the truth. And one thing that really stuck out to me when I was revisiting this film is that Milla Jovovich was very much still finding her feet here. I don't know how far into her acting career she was at this point, but she really seems like a less confident performer, and Alice is kind of a less impactful presence. It's really Michelle Rodriguez who steals the show, and I honestly believe that her performance in this movie is genuinely great. I mean, say what you will about the movie itself, but Michelle Rodriguez is on fire here, and she basically redeems the whole thing. But overall though, I think this film is still watchable. I gave it 3 stars because of that. It's a somewhat competently made zombie movie, but it just doesn't really excel in any area. So with that in mind, let's just move on. Next up is Resident Evil Apocalypse, and I was really surprised just how much of a slog it was to get through this movie. As I say in my Letterboxd review, this is the first horror movie I ever saw, and for a little while I thought they were all like this, which is kind of funny. But I think because it was the first horror movie I ever saw, I've always felt a certain sentimental attachment to this film, and I'm getting to an age now where that's sort of wearing off, and actually I realise how terrible it is. I gave it 2 stars in total. That was as generous as I could be, and let me tell you why. One of the worst things about it is that Milla Jovovich is basically not in this film for the first hour, and bear in mind, these are only 90-minute movies, so that's 2/3 gone, and hardly any Milla. Now, she does kind of come back for the final action sequence, but it's really poorly executed. The script in this one is terrible. It is the worst one, without a doubt, and it was at this point in my latest Resident Evil rewatch where I wondered if maybe I had finally outgrown these movies, because I was 2 entries down and still without a hit. Fortunately, that changed when I watched Resident Evil Extinction once again. Upon revisiting Resident Evil Extinction this time, I was genuinely shocked at just how genuinely well made it is, and I put a lot of the credit for that down to director Russell Mulcahy. I reckon that he is, probably the best director this series has ever and will ever see. There are some genuinely nice shots, the action sequences are well done, the zombie makeup is fantastic, and the supporting cast, I think, is probably the strongest in the entire series. Maybe. Don't hold me to that. I have a right to change my mind. But particularly, I do really like Ali Larter as Claire Redfield. I think she makes a much bigger impression than Sienna Glory ever did as Jill Valentine. And to give Paul W.S. Anderson some credit, although he didn't direct this one, he did still write the screenplay, and I think it's probably the best script he's ever written. It's a really satisfying little fantasy story, and there are some nice payoffs and even some funny jokes in it. Again, I'm as shocked as you are about this. If I'm using my head, then Resident Evil Extinction is without a doubt the best film in the series. But if I'm using my heart, it's got to be Resident Evil Afterlife. So I do these Resident Evil rewatches on a semi-regular basis because I'm a glutton for punishment, but Resident Evil Afterlife is the only one that I every now and then rewatch outside of these little experiments. Sometimes I'll just wake up in the morning and think, I want to watch Resident Evil Afterlife today. Can you imagine what the inside of my mind must be like? That is a logical train of thought that I occasionally have. I genuinely love this movie. I don't care that it's bad, I don't care what anybody has to say about it particularly. As I say in my Letterboxd review, if loving this movie is wrong, I don't want to be right. And I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. Now, why though? Why do I love Resident Evil Afterlife? Well, let me count the ways. First and foremost, every single action sequence in this movie is batshit crazy. And from some people that might be a criticism, but for me it's an absolute selling point. I think that Paul W.S. Anderson comes up with some genuinely really creative, engaging, and visually interesting action sequences here, and I just love watching them play out, particularly as they all revolve around Milla Jovovich, who is on top form here. This is the film where she really became Alice and really reached her full potential as an action superstar. I like the supporting cast in this one too. Obviously they're all cannon fodder to some extent, but I do think that there are some memorable personalities in the bunch, and of course we've got to mention Sean Roberts as Albert Wesker, the primary antagonist of this movie. And he's absolutely fantastic as a pantomime, scenery-chewing villain. Bravo. I couldn't ask for more. On Letterboxd, I gave this movie 4 stars and a love heart, and I regret nothing. Now, the only drawback of my undying love for Resident Evil Afterlife is that it means this series really did peak with the 4th entry for me, and we've still got 2 more to go. Let's proceed with Resident Evil Retribution, the 5th film in the series, and I have to say I've never really been a big fan of this one. We can argue back and forth about how worthwhile the storylines to any of these movies are, but Resident Evil Retribution really takes it to an extreme. The story is virtually non-existent. It is paper thin. It really just boils down to the characters moving from room to room and killing everything inside. And you could maybe get away with that if the action was really well choreographed and really well directed, but as I say in my Letterboxd review, it's pretty meh. And that is really the best way I can describe it. I don't think it's awful by any means, but really nothing memorable happens in this movie, with the only exception perhaps being the final confrontation, but that really is all this film has to offer. I think it's cool that they managed to get back Michelle Rodriguez, Sienna Glory, even Oded Fair for this movie, but none of them really get to do anything remotely interesting, so overall it feels like quite a missed opportunity. And the new characters introduced to the supporting cast are incredibly lame, and I have to name and shame Johan Erb because his performance is utterly, utterly terrible. Really the only thing this film has going for it is the visual effects. I believe this was the most expensive film in the franchise, coming in at around $65 million, and it really shows, you know, the effects look really polished, really shiny, really nice, but there is just nothing else to it. This is perhaps the ultimate example of style over substance. And overall the film just feels shockingly redundant because the whole thing is poised towards setting up an epic final chapter, which is completely different to the final chapter that we eventually got. So what was the point? So on that note, let's move on to the final chapter, and I really do have some grievances with this movie. I don't know what was going on behind the scenes, but clearly something did not go to plan, because as previously mentioned, this film completely throws out the original idea for the final chapter and replaces it with something far, far worse. I think we've always known that Paul W.S. Anderson has been making it up as he goes along when it comes to the story of these movies, but here it really is particularly blatant. The opening recap of this movie actually contradicts things that happen in Resident Evil Apocalypse, so it's really, really strange. Without a doubt, my biggest complaint about this movie is the lack of returning protagonists. They managed to get Ali Larter back as Claire Redfield, and that's nice. I do think she's genuinely good in the role. I've got no issue with that character. But in my eyes, as the final chapter, they really should have tried to get back every surviving protagonist from the previous movies to really wrap it up in a bow. Instead, the only supporting protagonist we get back is Claire. The rest of the supporting cast are some of the most laughably, shamelessly disposable characters I think I have ever seen in a horror movie. They are really so incredibly forgettable. Thankfully, on the villain side, they do at least manage to get Ian Glenn back, and he does a lot of the heavy lifting here. He is 110% committed, and probably, you know, the standout cast member of the entire film, Milla Jovovich included. So, aside from all the cast issues, there's also a lot of issues with the action sequences here. They are some of the worst in the entire series. I don't know how that's possible. It's almost like Paul W.S. Anderson forgot how to direct in the time since the last movie. It might also have something to do with the fact that the budget was significantly lower for the final chapter, which I'm a little bit resentful to Sony Pictures about. I think it would have been nice if they could have allowed this series, a long-running franchise for them, to go out with a bang. But instead, you know, the budget was slashed. It really shows on screen. Some of the visual effects are wonky as fuck, and it's just such a shame. No doubt that also affected which cast members they could compel to return as well, so it all kind of comes full circle with that. But yeah, I still gave Resident Evil the final chapter 3 stars on Letterboxd, and I really had to take a look at myself when I did that, because this movie undoubtedly does not deserve that. But I do think, to a certain extent, I'm still in denial over just how bad it is. And that brings to a close our Resident Evil retrospective. Look, for all of the complaints I have for this series, ultimately I'm still a fan. I'll probably watch them all again at some point in the not too distant future. And I don't know why. There's just something so appealing about their B-movie charm. And for the love of God, someone cast Mila Jovovich in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.